I'm back again. This is episode 9, like in the whole grand scheme here, but episode 2 for exam 3. Uh, yeah, so didn't get through all the way through it yesterday, so I'm gonna alternate, and this time I'm gonna start from the last question and work back, and I'll probably just do that for each of them until I maybe can get through the whole thing in a reasonable time. So yeah, today I'll start at the end of the outline. So today I'll be starting with kind of the Wilderness Act and differentiation between wilderness areas and multiple use areas and uh, uh, you know limits on discretion for management. Uh, yeah, I have gone through and I've updated the PowerPoint a bit over last night and then this morning. Spent a pretty good deal just adding slides. Granted, most of it is ESA stuff. I've added a lot of slides for the ESA. I haven't really done a whole lot for Wilderness Act yet, or National Parks or Antiquities Act. So, like I said, most of the slides that I added are all ESA related, but I think there's like one or two Wilderness Act slides as well. So let's see if I can might as well just get us to where we're going to be starting today. DPSs, no. Still on ESA. Still on ESA. There's Antiquities Act. So we are here. I think this is the last slide. Okay. Anyways, I'll reference that when I need to, but I'll just get started. I didn't think yesterday went too bad, and just going back through and kind of working on the slides helped too, and the slides will help. But anyways, all right, I'm just gonna get started here. So this is the last question, question number 29. How are multiple use lands administered by the National Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management managed differently than lands designated as wilderness under the 1964 Wilderness Act? Please explain the major differences, including philosophy and purposes of each mandate/system, uses allowed and not allowed in both systems. The issue of managerial discretion and reference the relevant statutes in your answer. So this is another, like I said yesterday, a lot of 15 pointers on this preparation, and this is one of all, another one. So it's just long answers, elaborate answers. But yeah. So I'll just start off with the BLM slash Forest Service multiple use lands, and then you got the multiple use mandate in FLIPMA, Section 202, Part C, Number 1, shall use and observe the principles of multiple use. Then defines multiple use as management of the public lands and their various resources so that they are utilized in the combination that will best meet the present and future needs of the American people. A combination of balanced and diverse resource uses that takes into account the long-term needs of future generations for the renewable and non-renewable resources, including but not limited to recreation, range, timber, minerals, watershed, wildlife and fish, and natural, scenic, scientific, and historical values. And then I have paraphrased this a bit, so there are some parts removed from the definition of multiple use, but without permanent impairment of the productivity of the land and the quality of the environment, with consideration being given to the relative values of the resources and not necessarily the combination of uses that will give the greatest economic return or greatest unit output. So there's no in the multiple use mandates, as seen in FLIPMA or in the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act of 1960 for the Forest Service. Neither of them have any prohibited uses for the land. That's something we'll come to see here in the Wilderness Act, and I cover that in a few minutes. But and kind of going back to multiple use, I do got that. This slide actually does directly pertain to this one. But just kind of reviewing to what we hit pretty heavy in the last section was, we have major cases in multiple use, such as the Perkins versus Berglund, which essentially established how much discretion, or the wider range of discretion that multiple use gives an agency. And you got that famous language from that case. The court's referring to multiple use, quote, general clauses and phrases that can hardly be considered concrete limits on agency discretion, and breathes discretion at every pore. So highly discretionary to how the Forest Service or the BLM's, what multiple use they want to manage that land for, and that is in direct opposition is what we'll come to see in the Wilderness Act. Like I said, in a few minutes, we did have a little bit of a little bit of a limit on that discretion when we touched on the comb wash allotment case, and that was one of the at least for in what we touched on. And I'm sure there's other examples, but there's not a whole lot of examples of the courts not deferring to the agency's multiple use management. But in that case, they did. The agency was remanded, and in that as arbitrary and capricious to open that allotment for grazing because they had failed to make a reasoned and informed decision and had failed to balance the competing multiple uses. So really, the major limited discretion in multiple use, those multiple use mandates, MUSIA and the Section 202 of FLIPMA, is that there has to be some sort of balancing, in a reasoned and informed manner of those multiple uses. But it's outside of that, there's really not a whole lot. There's none of the multiple uses are weighed any differently. There's none of them that are favored over any of the others. It's multiple use management. It's supposed to be that they're all, evenly balanced and compared. And like I said, there's no prohibited actions on those multiple use lands either. So moving into the wilderness areas, that'll be, administered by the BLM or Forest Service, depending on who had jurisdiction of that land prior to it being designated as a wilderness. But right off the bat, there's the non-impairment mandate of the Wilderness Act, Section 2A. Wilderness areas ... shall be administered for the use and enjoyment of the American people in such a manner as well as leave them unimpaired for future use and enjoyment as wilderness, and so as to provide for the protection of these areas, the preservation of their wilderness character. ... Again, I paraphrased it a bit, but essentially, yeah, there's definitely already a mandate in that section there, Section 2A, that these wilderness areas, they shall be administered for the use and enjoyment of the American people, leave them unimpaired for future use, and the preservation of their wilderness character. So there's an emphasis on the preservation of this wilderness character in that mandate, unlike the multiple use mandate where there is no, it's not like there's no pushing for preservation or any sort of use. This, as a Wilderness Act, has a direct mandate to preserve for that wilderness character and to leave those lands unimpaired for future use. So it's a lot less. It's already, with that section, it places some blinders on the discretion of the agency. And then if moving on, Section 4C, you have the prohibitions of the wilderness areas, and this is pretty much, of course, there are the minimum necessity exceptions, but it's a list of things that are strictly prohibited on designated wilderness areas. So, you got your no commercial enterprise, no permanent roads, no temporary roads, no motor vehicle use, no motorized equipment, no motorboats, no landing of aircraft. I feel like there was others. I might be missing, a few more prohibitions there, but essentially, yeah, they're in the statute. There are uses that are strictly prohibited from occurring, except with the exceptions. And I think we'll kind of get into those a little bit later with the different other questions. But so yeah, comparing that to the multiple use mandate, multiple use mandate is pretty wide open in this how that is managed. The Wilderness Act in the statute, already has this mandate to preserve for that wilderness character, and then also provides this list of prohibitions that is a list of stuff that's not uses that are not allowed to be managed for on these wilderness areas. And down here, I have the COFA National Wildlife Refuge and / wilderness. It's kind of a supplementary thing that we've been doing in class for it, but I've been reading up on it quite a bit. But anyways, yeah, the COFA National Wildlife Refuge and / wilderness, had originally been designated as that wildlife refuge and had been a wildlife refuge from 1939 to what was it? I think it was 1990 that it was it was either 1990 or 1980 that it was designated as a wilderness, or like 82% of it was designated as a wilderness. I can't remember. It's 1980 or 1990. For some reason, I'm blanking there. But essentially, yeah, so it had been a wildlife refuge for a large portion of its lifespan, and then it had been, the lands, or a major portion of it was designated wilderness. And so, And a key reason for that designation as a wildlife refuge was preservation of the desert bighorn sheep. And so they had throughout that time as a wildlife refuge, they had done things to ensure that population was stable, and in like the 600 to 800 range is I think where they kind of shot for. And early 2000s that population dipped off, and now they had in their report they had listed off a lot of reasons as to why. Drought was the first reason they had listed, at least, or lack of adequate water sources on the refuge. But then they had also listed translocation, predation from mountain lions, hunting, and hiker human interference with their breeding, or favorable ground, calving grounds, or what's a baby sheep called, lambing grounds. But so the Kofo National Wildlife Refuge, they put in a couple new tanks, and one of them was not on the wilderness land, the other one was, and they were litigated for it because it was in conflict, or the argument was that it was in conflict with the Wilderness Act. But anyways, I'm getting off topic, and you can see that even if they were trying to preserve, they were doing things for the preservation of a native species, there was constraints placed on them in that case. I'm not going to go into the full case because it would take me a while, but the reason I put it there is just even to do things such as that, it's like an action like that, just to preserve bighorn sheep or do an action that would hopefully favor bighorn sheep, it still results in litigation and having to jump through hoops. I think I kind of covered a good portion of that one, so I'm going to keep rolling. 28. What is a national park enabling law? Oh, this was one I wanted to do a slide for, and I didn't get around to it. So, that'll be something I'll work on for the next one. But okay, so the enabling laws for national parks, Congress, they're written by Congress, pursuant to the Organic Act of the National Parks when designating a new national park. So each national park gets these enabling laws, and these enabling laws contain site-specific management criteria for that park to be prioritized. So enabling laws, and site-specific criteria. That site-specific criteria in those enabling laws takes precedent over the Organic Act language. So there can be some differences between those enabling laws and the Organic Act of these of national parks. Lights just came on over there again. I don't know why it's been doing that. So those enabling laws are, when a new park is added to the national park system, they're written pursuant to the Organic Act, but they can, they have site-specific, rules and site-specific management priorities that might differ from the language of the Organic Act. What is the purpose of national park management under the National Park Service Organic Act of 1916? So, purpose of the National Park Management under the Organic Act, they had that dual mandate, was something we talked about, where it was conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objectives and the wildlife therein, and then there was the provide for the enjoyment of the same in such manner and by such means as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. So you have that conserving of the scenery and natural, conservation, and then you got that conservation and providing for enjoyment. So that's like that dual mandate, and these kind of butt heads, especially in some situations. But so national parks are managed to conserve the values of the land while also providing enjoyment for those who visit. And like I said, these dual mandates are widely viewed as contradicting of each other a lot of the time. It can be difficult to manage for tours, enjoyment of tourists while still trying to manage for preservation of species and in the natural environment. 26. Explain the nature of the two political compromises in the wilderness. Explain the nature of two political compromises evident in the Wilderness Act of 1964. Provide an example of how one of these compromises could challenge the management of wilderness character. So first one here I got is both of them are in Section 4, Part D. That's where you kind of find, or a lot of those compromises are found. But Section 4, Part D, Number 1, such measure may be taken as may be necessary in the control of fire, insects, and disease, subject to such conditions as the Secretary deems desirable. So this essentially gives discretion to the Secretary to take measures to control fire, insects, and disease within a designated wilderness. And and also it gives that it gives the Secretary just you got that open that last line, Secretary deems desirable. So it places a little less little limit on the discretion of the Secretary onto what extent they may use to mitigate these insects, disease, fire on the wilderness. And there's no in that statute. There's no standards indicated on as to how far they can manage for those things or for how much they can manage them. So this definitely, kind of a compromise. Allowing for management of insects, disease, or fire within the wilderness. And then next one here I have Section 4, Part D, Number 3. Until midnight, December 31st, 1983, the United States mining laws and all laws pertaining to mineral leasing shall, to the same extent as applicable prior to September 3rd, 1964, extend to those national forest lands designated by this chapter as wilderness areas. So essentially what this does here is gives miners and prospective lessees were given 20 years to locate mining claims and pursue leases within these designated wilderness areas or newly designated wilderness areas. And then this also, miners could still apply for the patent of their claims within these wilderness areas up until December 31st, 1983. And the claims and patents made prior to 1983, prior to that 1983 withdrawal kind of posed management challenges in respect to access. How are they going to get in there to now that they have a claim that's located in the middle of this wilderness area or even patented little chunk of land in the middle of this wilderness. Now, how do they get in there? What and how? That poses a challenge. And then I do also got something here, I guess. And a little example. But yeah, so anyways, there was that compromise there where at the passage of the Wilderness Act, it gave a 20-year window where people could still go in there and prospect or potential leases could go in there and explore for opportunities for mining. So it didn't totally slam the door shut on that. So anyways, I got here, agency, these conflict, I guess this kind of pertains with Section 4D1, the insect. It asks provide for an example of how one of these compromises would challenge the management of wilderness character. Okay, so then kind of tying back into the first one, the fire, insects, and disease management in the wilderness. So you have this case of Sierra Club versus Ling, and essentially the Forest Service had authorized a pine beetle control program within the wilderness area, and this program required this mitigation required extensive cutting and the use of chemical spraying. So this definitely kind of went against the agency mandate to preserve natural conditions in the wilderness, in the wilderness character of the area. You go in there and you do this extensive cutting and spraying. You can definitely see that it's a bit of a contradiction to that wilderness mandate that we saw in the last one, the Section 2A. I think I'm going to go back through that one and flesh out that answer a bit more, but 25. Who designates federal wilderness areas? What agencies manage them? So Congress designates the wilderness areas via statute, and then wilderness areas are then managed by the agency who had jurisdiction of the land immediately prior to the land being designated as wilderness. So, say that was Forest Service land, then it got designated as a wilderness area, then it's now going to be managed by the Forest Service. What is an individual national park and or wilderness enabling / establishment law? How might these laws impact management of parks and or wilderness areas? So the enabling and establishing law are written by Congress when designating an individual national park or wilderness. Enabling laws establish units pursuant to the Organic Act, and enabling laws are site-specific to the unit in its authorizing legislation. Management enabling laws versus enabling acts. These enabling laws may require or authorize management approaches inconsistent with the general preservation policy. Enabling law of unit provides certain site-specific management options to be considered by the administering agency. These site-specific management options take precedent over the management considerations of the Organic Act. So the person in charge of this national park or managing this wilderness has to first answer to the enabling law site-specific management considerations, and then the Organic Act considerations. The site-specific considerations take precedent. The site-specific considerations of the enabling law take precedent over the Organic Act. And I guess I got an example here of elk hunting. That is, the allowance of elk hunting within Grand Teton National Park. That's statutorily sanctioned in the enabling law of Grand Teton, and indicates a specified consideration to take place at the unit. By law, federally designated wilderness areas are to be untrammeled. What does this mean? Provide a management example in your response. So untrammeled, essentially, in the statute, it's got untrammeled is man himself is not a visitor who does not remain undeveloped federal land, no permanent improvements or human habitation. But I guess more of just like a dictionary definition, it's natural, unhindered, and free from actions of modern human control or manipulation. And I guess to go the other route, I guess untrammeled, not developed or untouched, without restraint or impediment or unhindered. And when I had read this initially, I had thought it was, I read it as just untrammeled and kept going, and it wasn't until I went through his notes and saw that he explicitly made a little note saying not untrammeled, and I reread it. I was like, oh, trammeled, I don't know what that means, but went back through, and then and then just look up the dictionary too of to trammel something is to hinder or to restrain or to shackle. I guess just a little example, my hunting plans for Thanksgiving break were trammeled by my preparation for the impending Natural Resource Policy and Administration exam. So to trammel something is to hinder it. So something that's untrammeled would be unhindered, or unshackled, kind of free, I guess, free of manipulation. So then I guess a management example of something that is untrammeled, of that untrammeled wilderness area would be the Forest Service allowing those lightning ignited fires to burn within a wilderness. So this is kind of that untrammeled wilderness character. They let those fires, lightning strike fires, go. Cause the and they have these. I guess I was reading. They have these minimum, and then the Forest Service has these minimum impact suppression techniques that they use to preserve that untrammeled quality. If they do have to go in there and put off a fire or suppress a fire, if it's potentially poses a threat to a community that's outside the wilderness area or private property outside the wilderness area. But they have these minimum impact suppression techniques that are designed to cause the least alteration and disturbance of the wilderness, and essentially are the main goal of fire of suppression in the wilderness is just essentially to prevent fires from escaping the wilderness and threatening nearby communities. They're not the suppression is in the wilderness is very limited. It's essentially the goal is just to prevent it from escaping out of the wilderness and threatening private property and people. How are lands designated as federal wilderness to be managed according to the Wilderness Act of 1964? Be sure to explain the term wilderness character and its component parts in your response. So I guess right off the bat, so you have that mandate. Each agency administering any area designated as wilderness shall be responsible for preserving the wilderness character of the area. So that's preserving of the wilderness character is directly mandated by those administering agencies. So and then as to define as it's defined, there's a definition of wilderness in the statute, and I should do a slide I should do a slide for this, just kind of defining this next time. But so wilderness, as defined in the statute, essentially is that untrammeled by man, undeveloped. Or I guess here's like the component parts of the wilderness definition at least. So it's untrammeled by man, undeveloped federal land primarily affected by the forces of nature, outstanding opportunities for solitude or a primitive and unconfined recreation, protected and managed so as to preserve its natural conditions, and then there's also the at least 5,000 acres or is of sufficient size to make practicable its preservation. May also contain ecological, geological, or other features of scientific, education, scenic, or historical value. So yeah, and then there's you got these prohibited uses as I discussed a couple questions ago. You got that no commercial enterprise, no permanent roads, no temporary roads, no motor vehicles, no motorized equipment, motorboats, landing of aircraft, no other forms of mechanical transport, no structure or installation. And then there is the exception rule where it's those prohibited uses may be used only when necessary to meet the minimum requirements to administer the area as wilderness. So only those things can only be used. Those prohibited actions can only be used when they are the minimum necessity to retain that area's wilderness character at those natural conditions. And yeah, so like I said, these wilderness areas are managed by those agencies that had jurisdiction of the land immediately before its wilderness designation. I think that was all. I guess that's all I got on that one. But yeah, I guess the components, untrammeled, undeveloped, solitude, natural conditions. Okay. Holy moly. That's all one question. Whoa. All right. Kind of a long one here. This slide goes with this one, though. Does federal wilderness provide greater protection to lands than those that are covered by the roadless rule? I should not have worn so many clothes. The sweater was not a good call for this. I'm sweating. Pretty good. I might run and use the restroom real quick. All right. I'll do it after this question. Does federal wilderness provide greater protection to lands than those that are covered by the roadless rule and those designated and managed as areas of critical environmental concern by the BLM? Please explain and substantiate, and be sure to tell me what you mean by greater. So right off the bat, reading this, I interpreted that greater protection as like something that would have greater protection has more limits on the discretion of the agency as to how they manage that land. So I guess maybe more focus on that dominant use of preservation. Yeah, again, more of a dominant preservation use would have greater protection as I consider it. And I got this slide here. I was going crazy with the MS Paint again, but so you got your lower level protection here, you got your greatest protection here, and this is kind of, I don't know, I think this is kind of relative because these all, I think, for protections on the land. But protection, limits placed on agencies, discretion, multiple use discretion, and like I said, the greatest protection I think would probably be more of like that dominant use favoring preservation, or favoring that wilderness character or those natural conditions of the land versus multiple use or allowing more uses on that land that might be detrimental to that natural character, wilderness character or natural condition. So I guess kind of just working from the top. So on this scale here, like the one that I'd say probably that puts the greatest protection on the land would be the Wilderness Act, 1964, which and that especially I kind of look at that and immediately I'm drawn to that Section 4 prohibition section when I'm considering these what would provide the greatest protection, because this is the only out of these three, this is the only one that's got like an actual well, I take that back, but this has got that extensive prohibition section, and this is also congressional statute as well, statutory protections for these wilderness areas. But you got that Section 4 prohibitions, the no roads, permanent or temporary, commercial enterprise, motor vehicles, motor equipment, boats, landing of aircraft, mechanical transport, which includes bikes, and no structures or installation. So I think I feel like that definitely, not to mention the mandate to preserve for that wilderness character, that unimpairment mandate, preserving for that wilderness character and the natural conditions of that land. Protected and managed. Like right there, I got it. Protected and managed so as to preserve its natural conditions. So that is like, it has that dominant use mandate of just preserving for those natural conditions. And then, kind of moving on to the mid to middle of the sandwich here, the protection sandwich. We haven't talked about this in class yet. I'm a bit unsure of what exactly the roadless rule is. I've read on it, and I don't know, there's a lot of moving parts with it or something. I don't know. I think I'm probably just overthinking it. But essentially, so I have the 2001 roadless rule here in the middle. And it's, it's a result of, and in the Wilderness Act of 1964, there was a mandate given by Congress to the secretary or the head of the Forest Service that all Forest Service lands, forested lands, need to be inventoried within 10 years, and in order to identify potential areas with wilderness area designation potential. So they do that, and they conduct these. Well, they initially conduct this. I can't remember what, the rare one and rare two. Rare one review, and they find all these potential wilderness lands, and then there's some I can't. It's like I said, it's kind of like confusing, but they do that one, and then they do a second rare two review where they designate they inventory the land. They pass along proposals for all these lands that have potential to be wilderness. But essentially, so they come out with this roadless rule in 2001, and essentially it applies to all those lands with wilderness potential that they identified in the rare 1 and 2 reviews. But maybe they haven't been designated, these aren't lands that were designated, though. They have the potential to be wilderness, but they haven't been designated by Congress. And maybe it's, they have conditions that are very similar to national or wilderness areas, but maybe there's just some disqualifying bar. But essentially, this 2001 roadless rule, it does have a couple prohibitions that come along with it. So for these, and what falls under the 2001 roadless rule are these inventory roadless areas, IRAs, that were identified in the rare 1 and 2 reviews. And these IRAs essentially, there's some prohibitions that that there's no road construction and no timber harvests within these IRAs, and I think also road reconstruction as well within these IRAs. But so there's some limits, and the thing is, it doesn't have those that congressional statute protection, so it's not statutory level protection. Because then there was this 2005 roadless rule that was released, which I think it was like Wyoming, Colorado, and maybe Idaho. I don't think I have it. Colorado, Idaho. So yeah, 2005 roadless rule comes in, and it I have here that it revoked the 2001 roadless rule, which I don't know quite. I don't know. But anyways, essentially, but it still mentions the roadless rule, 2001 rule. But it established individual roadless rules for Colorado, Idaho, and the Tongass National Forest in Alaska. And I guess it designated through a set of maps within their own roadless. Yeah, okay. See, that's where I'm getting confused with the 2005 roadless rule, the 2001 roadless rule. This is something I think I'm going to go into office hours and ask about, because it is just kind of a CF a little bit. Pardon my crudeness. And then, of course, and then at the bottom here, the lowest level in this tier list, yet again, maybe I'll go into, and talk about this, and I'll figure out that this doesn't really do much for protection at all. But I have the BLMs and ACECs here at the bottom. So, FLPMA 202, Section 3, Secretary shall give priority to designation and consideration of ACECs during land use planning process. Then the definition is, areas where special management attention is required to prevent and protect against irreparable damage to significant resources. So like we saw in the last one, there was those Gunnison sage grouse areas of critical environmental concern in Colorado, Utah, maybe Wyoming a little bit too. I think it was Colorado and Utah mostly. But within those designated areas, these are on just BLM multiple use lands. But when you identify an area of critical, designated an area, that may come with limits on what multiple uses are done there, or limits to what can occur there. So there's no direct prohibitions that come along with an area of critical environmental concern designation, but there's going to be measures taken to maintain the values of that area ACEC. So it might be closure to mineral leasing, road restrictions, access restrictions, maybe closing of those maybe no longer going to be open to grazing, closing of grazing allotments. I think it's up to whoever the planning. That's determined in the planning process as to how that area is going to be limited in its future activities. But yeah, so with the roadless rule and the ACACs, there's none of those like or I guess with the roadless rule there are prohibitions. So that's why I put it above the ACECs. But I don't know, outside of the prohibitions, I'm not really sure exactly how else the roadless rule, what else it does. So that's one I'm definitely gonna dig on a little bit more. Let's see, where am I here? So it was 21. Okay. So, from a designation standpoint, how is the U.S. Forest Service roadless rule different than the federal wilderness? So the wilderness areas, like I mentioned before, are designated by Congress in statute. Then the Forest Service, through the Rare 1 and 2 reviews, have identified these areas that are potential wilderness areas, or large roadless areas at least. And so they identified these areas, and then in the 2001 roadless rule, they designated these IRAs, inventory roadless areas, and gave them the protections that I mentioned in the previous question. The prohibitions of road construction and timber harvest. So that's I guess so. The roadless areas, or the inventory roadless areas, are kind of designated by the Forest Service, whereas the wilderness areas are designated by Congress in statute. Okay, I'm gonna run and use the restroom real quick. All right, I'm back. Sorry about the interruption there, but yeah, we're kind of cruising through this a little bit. Onto the Antiquities Act. What power was given to the president by the Antiquities Act of 1906? On what constitutional basis can what constitutional basis can Congress provide this power to the president? Why has the designation of national monuments caused conflict or controversy in the past? Make a substantiated argument for or against a more expansive use of the Antiquities Act by a president, such as making a landscape scale designation. Be sure to focus on the law, the text of the statute, and not just provide your political opinion here. So, Congress gave the president the authority to reserve areas of federal land for certain uses or limit certain multiple uses to preserve certain values of the land, historic, prehistoric objects of historic and scientific interest. The president, with the power of this act given to him by Congress, the president can place limits on multiple uses in these designated areas. Like mining withdrawals. I think that's like the most common one that comes along with these monument designations is mining withdrawals. That area is being withdrawn from mining. I think that's like the Bears Ear National Monument. I think is that's kind of been a big thing. Okay. On what? Okay. Congress provides this power to the president pursuant to the property clause of the Constitution. That Congress has that power to make all the needful rules and regulations respecting the property of the United States. So they can use that. They use that. Through that, they give the the president power to make rule or to designate these monuments as well. So here this one I made more of an argument for a more expansive use of the Antiquities Act by the president, or I guess or at least I just kind of think like I state here is that the president could use this to designate he could go like there's not much limits as to how much he could designate. So just looking at the language of the act, which I have pulled up here. But like in his discretion. So right off the bat, this act in his discretion is just pretty big. Declared by proclamation. Other objects of historic and scientific interest, and may reserve the only thing the really thing shall be confined to the smallest area compatible. So there's not a whole lot of limits on his discretion. Really, the biggest limit to his discretion that I see in here is that the lands have to be situated upon or owned or controlled by the United States. Outside of that, I mean, the shall be confined to the smallest area compatible is subject to his discretion. There's no we'll read here. I guess I have it on here. But in the Tulare County versus George Bush case. This was a challenge of Clinton, Bill Clinton. I don't know why I was thinking George. Bill Clinton, he had designated the giant sequoia as national monument, and they challenged that he had, the monument was not confined to the smallest area compatible. However, the courts come back and pretty much state that the Antiquity Act does not oblige the president to make a meaningful investigation or determination of the smallest area necessary to protect any specified objects or scientific interests. So essentially, what the court said there is that it's pretty much the president's own discretion as to what the smallest area compatible is. So, that's one of my kind of arguments is as I kind of take the position here that the president could use it to, make large or land scale designations is that even the courts have stated in the past, courts have found that there's no, within the statute, there's no limit on that, on his discretion. It doesn't say shall be confined to the smallest area compatible with, using the best available science or using a team of, there's none of that. It's just essentially, in his discretion. And then, kind of going back, the President Theodore Roosevelt, he had proclaimed the Grand Canyon as the national monument, and eventually it was, transitioned to a national park. But, initially it was a national monument. And this was challenged by Ralph Cameron, who had a couple of mining claims around the rim of the Grand Canyon and then in the Grand Canyon. And prior to its designation as a national monument, he had used these mining claims to charge fees for people to hike, people who are hiking in the, hiking down into the canyon. He'd charge fees, to pass through, because they had to pass through his claims, essentially. And then eventually, the monument's declared, he has to. Well, then I think there were some challenges to his claims before that. Anyway, he wasn't actually mining much, so there've been challenges. Essentially, he ends up taking it all the way to the Supreme Court, and he's challenging that the national monument designation by Theodore Roosevelt, and the Supreme Court again. This was, I guess, probably the first case, but they deferred to Theodore Roosevelt's discretion that to declare that as a national monument because it is, it is an object of unusual scientific interest. And, they even say, greatest eroded canyon in the U.S., over a mile deep, regarded as one of the greatest national wonders. So, the courts, so the courts essentially said, well, are deferred because, it's, that language is very ambiguous, it's object of scientific interest. Yeah, you could definitely say the Grand Canyon's an object of scientific interest. That's pretty hard to disagree with, and so there's there's very little limit there as to to what he can designate, and then they didn't even really address it, but the court's decision was that the size of the monument was not disqualifying if the protected object was otherwise of scientific interest, because they didn't even end up touching on the size of the national monument in that case, because they had already determined that it was. They already deferred to him because it was an object of unusual scientific interest. But then in the Bush case, the courts deferred to the president's discretion in the area compatible because it's their discretion. I don't know. The way I see it is the Antiquities Act really is kind of just a blank check. Really, I don't know. It seems to me at least. The main just level of discretion is that the land's got to be federal. But I'd say probably the most discretion just is would be political. The president wanting to be reelected is probably the highest level of discretion on him. And there's a picture of Theodore Roosevelt right there, laughing, getting a good laugh out of the Antiquities Act. Ooh, a little bit of a redo question here. What power was given to the president by the Antiquities Act of 1906? On what constitutional basis can Congress provide this power to the President? Why has the designation of national monuments caused conflict or controversy in the past? Please explain, focusing on one particular area of conflict or controversy, and be as specific as possible. So Congress gives the President the authority to reserve areas of federal land for certain uses, or to limit certain multiple uses, to preserve certain values of the land, whether they be historic, prehistoric, or objects of historic and scientific interest. The president, like I said in the last one, the president can use this to place limits on the multiple uses for those areas, and like I use the example of mining withdrawals on those lands, or maybe I don't think it's very common, but they could restrict recreation access on those. Maybe they close it to hunting or something. I don't know. I don't think that's very common, but I think they could do that. I guess I don't see anything against it in the statute, so it's true. But okay, then kind of moving on is so it would be that what is one area of controversy or conflict in the past? Why is the designation okay? Yeah. Well, like I said, kind of leaned on with these. The last one is that that limiting, what is the smallest area compatible, or limits on size of these national monuments, and kind of going to the Theodore Roosevelt, case where he had, that Grand Canyon, 800,000 acres, and how it was challenged by that Ralph Cameron. He challenged that national monument designation, and the courts fully upheld, Theodore Roosevelt and deferred to his discretion. And they like I said, they didn't even acknowledge the size of the Grand Canyon because they didn't even hardly acknowledge the size of it because they had already it wasn't disqualifying if the protected object was of otherwise scientific interest. So they deferred to discretion on the size of the canyon because it's in the statute it's in his discretion what the smallest area compatible is. And like I said, with the Tulare County versus George W. Bush, the courts found that same, they actually directly addressed, that case was literally directly about the size of the national monument. And so it was addressed, and the plaintiffs argued that it wasn't confined to the smallest area possible, or area compatible, sorry. and like the courts came back and said, hey, the Antiquities Act doesn't oblige the president to make a meaningful investigation. That the Antiquities Act doesn't make any it doesn't force the president to take any steps in order to determine what the smallest area compatible is. It's totally in their discretion, and that has been a challenge. I think that's been an area of controversy. Is that I think that's one of the things is just the lack of limits as to the size of a national monument. And like I said, the main discretion outside of it having to be federal land is the president's view in the public eye. Here we go, round 3. What power was given to the president by the Antiquities Act of 1906? I actually have it here too. Congress gave the president the authority to declare by public proclamation historic landmarks, historic and prehistoric structures, and other objects owned or controlled by the government to be national monuments, and may reserve as a part thereof parcels of land confined to the smallest area compatible. So I shortened it up in some spots there, but yeah, essentially, like I've said multiple times, the Antiquities Act gives the president the authority to proclaim these national monuments, to reserve these sections of federal land and for certain uses and limit certain other multiple uses to not be done on them. In order to preserve certain values of the land, whether they be historic, prehistoric, objects of historic and scientific interest. So, like I said earlier, this gives the president can withdraw lands from, mineral entry. I think that's the biggest one, we talked about in class. Because like I said, I don't think, they don't do a whole lot usually take, reducing recreation on those, national monuments, but they certainly could. They could, they're free to, in their proclamation, they can, designate that land for, whatever uses they desire. It's not a multiple use mandate, that's for sure. No. It's pretty much, entirely in their discretion as to what that land, the uses of that land will be. But this is one that we've talked about a lot too lately. This one is, I think it's been, on the table for being either at least rewritten or repealed or changed. And I think that's going to be something, he's mentioned that in the next couple of years we could definitely see some change on the Antiquities Act front, because it is, it does give the president a ton of power, and it's definitely controversial. Like these two cases are kind of just scratching the surface. It's a pretty hot topic, especially in like Utah with the Bears Ear National Monument. It's still very relevant. These are older cases, but there's still lots going on with this even today. What is the most significant program in the United States supporting the acquisition of private lands into federal public land ownership for the purpose of access and conservation? Where does the funding for this program come from? So, the most significant program in the U.S. supporting acquisition of private lands is the Land and Water Conservation Fund, and essentially this is a $900 million per year, is allocated to this fund. It's appropriated, I guess, like I said when I was reading it, it was since the passage of the Great American Outdoors Act, that is where this money's that appropriations come from every year. Historically, it was just a yearly appropriation straight from Congress, but a lot of the revenue, the money that goes, that $900 million, where that comes from, is a lot of it is revenues from royalties from offshore federal oil and gas drilling or development. So there's that, tying in with the Mining Leasing Act, going back to the GML. Was that last test or 2 tests ago, the GML? I can't remember. I think it was last test. But just tying it in with that a little bit is, that revenues from those oil and gas offshore leases, it plugs into that $900 million appropriation for the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which is used to purchase private lands into the federal ownership. And like I said, I think in the book, it talked about this, a large area where this goes down is those private lands that are adjacent to national parks, and the acquisition of that land by the park to include that land into the park. I think I'll say park one more time in that sentence. Here we go. Another long one. Better take a drink of water before I start. I'm actually making decent time on this right now compared to yesterday. Still got a long ways to go. In a nutshell, how is the ESA different than NEPA in terms of its substantive, not procedural obligations? Please be sure to discuss jeopardy and the no-take provisions of the ESA. Why has the judiciary been significant in the development of both laws? Please explain with example, and be sure to reference TVA v. Hill. So, next, NEPA, going back to NEPA now, which was, I think that was test 1. But going back to NEPA, Section 102, that action forcing mechanism portion of NEPA, which, applies to all major federal actions significantly affecting the quality of the environment. But essentially, it provides when an EIS needs to be prepared, and then exactly what an EIS, what goes into an EIS. And then to follow, following all the listed requirements of an EIS, foreseeable environmental effects, adverse environmental effects that cannot be avoided, reasonable range of alternatives, the effects of those alternatives, short-term uses and maintenance of long-term productivity, the irreversible and irretrievable commitments of federal resources. So, those are those EIS requirements, and that's all pretty procedural requirements. I mean, the agency has to do that, but that's all procedural. They do that, then that satisfies that section. There is then following that, though, there is the the statement that the EIS shall accompany the proposal through the existing agency review process. So I think that is probably the most substantive part, at least as far as I've kind of understood here, is that requirement that EIS be considered and accompanied throughout the through the the proposal through the existing through the review process. And we saw the the importance of that in the Calvert-Cliffs versus the Atomic Energy Commission case, where the the Atomic Energy Commission did not consider the findings of the EIS to the fullest extent possible in their decision making. I think it was where they had just they had completed the EIS, they had done the procedural part, they had done all the components of the EIS, and then I think they had just left it in an envelope, and then they didn't even consider it. They just kind of, it was there, but no one looked at it. They didn't take a hard look, as they say in the case, and they were remanded for it. So, I mean, that is probably the most substantive part is that, there's the procedural aspect of the EIS and having to do it, but then there's the having to take that hard look at the EIS. Because, we saw in the Robertson versus the Meadow Valley case, where, it displayed that procedural side of NEPA, where, NEPA itself didn't, mandate particular results. All it does is prohibit uninformed rather than unwise decision making. So if they do this, they do the procedural stuff, and then, the only thing is they just have to consider it or show that they've considered it, show in the record they've taken that hard look. That's the substantive requirement of NEPA, at least. I think, I could be totally missing something here, too. Missing the point. But, okay, then kind of moving on to the ESA, where, that has some serious teeth and substantive requirements. It's a much more substantive statute. Section 7 and 9, they both have that substantive enforceable language. Section 7 is only directed towards federal agencies or federal actions. And, it requires that an action agency ensure that the action will not jeopardize the existence or adversely modify the habitat of listed species, and ensured using, that, and that insurance is found using those best available science. I think I do. Okay, keep going the wrong way with it. It's kind of weird going backwards. So that's section 10. Section 10, ESA, population segments. I guess here's TVA versus Hill. So this is pretty applicable. But anyways, so that Section 7 jeopardy provision, it requires that an agency ensure that they're not going to jeopardize the continued existence or adversely modify habitat of listed species, using that best available science. And, we saw that, like I said, in the TVA v. Hill case here, where that, that dam construction was already well underway, $80 million spent. Then there's the discovery of the snail darter in the river, and then the river itself is designated as critical habitat. Then there's finding that the construction of the completion of the dam will, destroy that critical habitat and jeopardize the existence of the snail darter. The dam is then enjoined by the Supreme Court, because the completion of the dam would jeopardize existence of the snail darter, and this really, and so here it puts that the teeth of Section 7 on full display. Being able to shut down, an 80 million, a project with $80 million already spent, to be shut down by a little snail darter. I think it's a small little, it's a perch, a little perch, couple inches. There's a picture of it right there. But yeah, so that shows the substantive requirement of Section 7. And then, so Section 9, you have that, the prohibition against takes, the taking prohibition. So it's unlawful for any person to take any such species. So this is not just limited to federal actions. This is, applies to state and, private as well. And, like I said, this makes it unlawful for anyone to take a listed species. And then the statute goes on to further, define take as harass, harm, pursue, hunt, shoot, wound, kill, trap, capture, collect, or attempt to engage in any such conduct. So, there's not a whole lot of, ambiguity in any of that language. However, it comes down to harm. And then you see in the Palila versus Hawaii Department of Natural Resources case, where you have the the introduced goats for recreational hunting, eating those mamane tree, seedlings and shoots. So they're, the endangered Palila bird requires those mature mamane trees for food and shelter. So by those goats eating those young seedlings, they're preventing those trees from growing, and therefore it was the island was then guilty of take, by preventing that future habitat that could potentially be there for the the Palila bird. And then following that, the Fish and Wildlife Service. But there was a new definition, a new regulation came out in defining harm to include that adverse modification of habitat that could, that would directly kill or harm or injure a listed species. So not only does take, apply to, direct take, but it also that indirect take that we saw in cases like Palila or the Babbitt versus Sweet Home, where people, harvesting of trees, destroying habitat as well. But yeah, so essentially, there's a lot more of that substantive language in Section 7 and 9 of ESA versus, Section 102 of NEPA, that hard look substantive enforceable language. That was a long one. A bunch of long ones now. How does the concept of multiple use differ from the ESA's no jeopardy provision? Be sure to discuss administrative discretion and the role of the courts and how they generally view these laws in your response. So multiple use, like I kind of was stating earlier, places little limits on agency discretion, opposed to the no jeopardy provision of the ESA, which greatly limits the discretion of the agency in decision making. So like going back to the Musia here. There's no enforceable or substantive language requiring the agency to weigh any of the multiple uses over others when managing lands. I kind of cite the Perkins versus Berglund case again here, where the courts interpret the language of Musa to be, hardly considered limits on, or hardly considered concrete limits upon agency discretion that breeds discretion at every pore. The courts defer to agency discretion when selecting for that multiple use, or for what multiple use to manage for. And then there was the exception of the comb wash allotment case, where the BLM didn't make it, they didn't quite do it in a reasoned and informed manner, so therefore they were remanded in that decision, and the courts didn't defer to their multiple use. That's about the only one of the few times that there's been examples of not deferring to that multiple use discretion. Whereas, with that no jeopardy provision of the ESA, Section 7, it's an enforceable and substantive language with teeth, and that, it really limits places some strong limits on agency discretion with that each federal agency shall ensure that any action is not likely to jeopardize the continued existence of any endangered species or threatened species or result in the destruction of adverse modification of habitat. So right there, you have that shall ensure that any action is not likely to jeopardize. So pretty much, that's pretty limiting on discretion. If you got to make sure that that action you are going to be committing is not going to, jeopardize existence or destroy, adversely modify habitat. And, going back to TVAV Hill, that how, that obviously, it came in after the fact, but, it limits that agency discretion to put in this dam there, to commit that action because that, that river had been designated as habitat. It was found that the completion of that dam was going to, adversely modify habitat and jeopardize the existence of the snail darter, and the court then placed an injunction on the dam that it already had a lot of work done and a lot of money spent, and it shows that it puts the teeth of Section 7 on display, because I think that was kind of the landmark case, the first big case that was like, whoa, like everyone took a step back and was like, whoa, the ESA was able to do that for the snail darter. It wasn't. Yeah, the snail darter is not. It's not like a bald eagle or a grizzly bear or one of those more iconic species. It's something that no one had probably even really heard of before the case. And it got that, and I even have it, on there. It gets, following this, it gets the reputation as that pit bull of environmental law. That's something you see and hear a lot when people talk about the ESA. But yeah, so essentially, ESA Section 7 places the limits on that agency actions. It places lots of limits on agency actions that may jeopardize a species or adversely modify its habitat if it's present in the area that the action may be going. Oh, I think I do have a slide for this one. I didn't realize I had so many slides. Okay. Here we go. What is one benefit for a listed species covered by a habitat conservation plan? So, I guess what these habitat conservation plans is they are kind of incentives for landowners to manage their land and in order to and take steps to mitigate adverse habitat modification and activities that would harm endangered and listed species. So essentially, first step is that it reduces the liability of having a listed species around for these private landowners. So it's no longer if you have that habitat conservation plan in place, putting a habitat conservation plan in place, is the landowner is going to take steps to ensure to promote habitat for that, the preservation and conservation of that listed species. And it's taking steps to do that. Conservation plan, yes. Conservation plan submitted by a private landowner designed to minimize and mitigate impact of development activities or minimize impact of development activities on protected species. Okay. Is that really all I got for that one? I mean, I guess it's a 5-point question, but yeah, I don't know, it's a bit odd. What is one benefit to non-federal actors / permittees? I mean, essentially what those habitat conservation plans is going to promote. It promotes landowners are taking steps to promote, habitat and, conserving that habitat for those endangered species instead of maybe the inverse or the perverse incentives to not, if they don't want, when they don't want those listed species around. Because it's kind of the incentives that come along with, once the landowner puts in that HCP, there's definitely some strong incentives, for that to be in place. What is one benefit to the non-federal actors / permittees involved in a habitat conservation plan? So, one of those was the 1994 no surprises policy, because they had initially they dropped the habitat conservation plan in the amendments in 1982, and they didn't really do, they weren't super popular. I think there was a pretty low enrollment in them. But then in 1994 there's this no surprises policy that's dropped, and adjacent to the habitat conservation plan. So here we got, I think that's, yeah, okay. Yeah. So it's tied in here. But anyway, so yeah, private landowner, then, he submits a conservation plan, he designs it to minimize and mitigate the impact and development activities on protected species. Then this will be reviewed. This HCP is going to be reviewed by the secretary, just to look for, like, because essentially they're done when there's a chance. Yeah, they're looking for that the taking will be incidental to, to the action. The applicant will, to the maximum extent practicable, minimize and mitigate the impact of such taking, and the applicant will ensure that the adequate funding will be provided for the plan, as well as other requirements might be met. So then, then the secretary, is also just determined that the provost, he makes sure that the taking that may be the incidental takings aren't gonna reduce the likelihood of survival, isn't gonna jeopardize the species as a whole, the listed species. And then after a public review and comment period, the secretary will issue an incidental take permit with that HCP. So that, like I said, it removes that liability on the landowner. Say if a landowner was not to be engaged in ACP and then maybe, accidentally take out a listed species, that definitely would have some big ramifications. I can't remember. In the book, I think it was like $10,000 or a year of imprisonment for an endangered. It's probably changed, but anyways, then tying into that 19, because this was kind of the original plan. The landowner entered in the HCP and it was approved by the secretary. They then would get that incidental take permit, removing that liability of an incidental take, an indirect taking. But like I said, this wasn't super popular. They didn't get a lot of enrollment. So then they moved, they released the no surprises policy in 1994, which essentially establishes that, these landowners who enter into an HCP for a listed species on their property will not be required to pay more or provide additional land for mitigation, regardless of changing species needs over time, except for under extraordinary circumstances. But essentially, this is like a deal is a deal. And so essentially, so if someone, gets into this HCP, they don't have to worry about, maybe having to do more in the future for that listed species, since they're already, since they're in the HCP. So it also might save them some money as well, and having to do more in the future if you do an HCP earlier. So I definitely think benefits to private landowners would definitely be that, one, that incidental take permit and that removal of liability from taking a endangered species, but also, when you have that no surprises policy down the road, it'll definitely save you some money. And then also, that applies, the no surprises applies to unlisted species. So I think it was in the book, say you write at HCP, and you also, maybe you consider an unlisted species in that HCP and how you're going to, mitigate and manage for those. If that unlisted species is eventually listed as an endangered species, you don't have to update your HCP. That'll continue to apply. So you don't have to, So that's another, incentive, is that, save you money, definitely. Save you money and, management, and, So there's definitely some benefits for the landowner. What ESA provision helps protect geographic areas, occupied and unoccupied, that are essential to the conservation of listed species? How does the designation help achieve the fundamental purpose of the ESA? So this is the Section 5 critical habitat designation. This requires critical habitat to be designated at most 1 year post listing. This is different than listing of endangered species, because this is following, I think it was the 1978 amendments. Following those, the critical habitat no longer has to be designated based solely on best available science, but it's also you consider a cost-benefit analysis of designating that critical habitat as well. And this critical habitat, adverse modification and destruction of critical habitat is, that's prohibited in Section 7, as we saw in the TVA versus Hill case. And it's essentially critical habitat. The idea behind establishing it is that it's essential to providing food and shelter and promoting recovery of that listed species. As it applies to the ESA, what is a candidate species? So a candidate species is that warranted but precluded species. It's maybe they were petitioned for it, and the the Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA says, yeah, it's it could definitely, a listing could be warranted for it, but we have other agency priorities at this time. So it's like it's on. I don't know if it's kind of like a waiting list essentially, but they also there might be strategies proposed that to prevent it from becoming listed. They might start taking, early mitigation strategies to prevent that from being listed further down the road. But I think, a large thing is it's like that warranted but precluded due to other agency priorities. Yeah, any species being considered by the agency for listing is endangered or threatened, but not yet the subject of a proposed rule. So it's kind of, I don't know, in the waiting room maybe. Yeah, I guess like a waiting room species. It's in the lobby, it's waiting, but they might be able to, get out there and give it a little shot of juice and maybe keep it out of the waiting room. I don't know. I think I actually have a slide for these listings. Am I going to go the wrong way? Yeah. I'm still going the wrong way. What the heck? Boomer moment here. Yeah, there we go. Yeah. But yeah, candidate species warranted but precluded by other agency priorities, effectively placed on hold. Where's the next one? With sufficient detail, describe an example of how the ESA has moved from being a strictly prohibitive law to one that is more permissive in nature. Be sure to discuss or reference TVA v. Hill somewhere in your response. So right off the bat, I kind of just lead off with TVA v. Hill. I'm just going to go back to it, I guess. Might as well. I have a slide for it. If I'm ever going to get there. I thought the transitions would be cool. I don't know. They're they're slow or something. I don't know. I'm not a huge fan of them in this setting anymore. Especially going from back to front. It's kind of a pain in the butt. But anyways, so initially with the, in the original 1973 ESA, the critical habitat designation, like I mentioned, has to be established, or that critical habitat has to be designated at most 1 year post listing of an endangered species. And in the original 1973 ESA, the critical habitat designation was solely based on best available science, same as the listing, the mandate for listing an endangered species. So then in TVA v. Hill, you have your snail darter discovered in the river and then listed as endangered. The Little Tennessee River is then identified as critical habitat and designated as critical habitat, and they did that using best available science, solely best available science. And they determined that the dam would cause adverse modification of the critical habitat. So, that violates the Section 7 of the Jeopardy provision of ESA, and the dam is enjoined and prevented from being completed with $80 million down the drain, down the river. Anyway, so then following the TV Hill versus case and that, critical habitat designation, there's these 1978 amendments, a lot of blowback from that dam enjoyment. But 1978 post-TVA Hill amendments, and in these amendments, it changes the critical habitat designation basis. So it no longer is that, same as the endangered species, but it changes from the sole best available science to also including the economic impact of the designation of that critical habitat, as well as any other relevant impact or of specifying any particular area as critical habitat. So it's it takes in that cost benefit analysis maybe. So it's definitely, it definitely kind of dulls the teeth of the critical habitat designation there when you have to consider other factors besides, just the best available science. And then it also, those 1978 amendments also create this God Squad committee, and I think I have, oh boy, here we go. Oh boy. Okay, yeah, I got a slide for it. But anyway, yeah, 1978 amendment also comes out with this new God Squad committee too, to exempt action from a Section 7 Jeopardy Jeopardy provision. Anyways, but this God Squad's formed, and they essentially, they may vote to exempt an action from Section 7 if no reasonable and prudent alternatives, if the benefits of the actions clearly outweigh the costs, and the action is of regional or national significance. And this squad is composed of the Secretaries of Ag, Army, Interior, administrators of the EPA, NOAA, Chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, and then state representatives appointed by the president. And even after the forming of this God Squad, they still came together and then they upheld the decision by the Supreme Court in the TVA versus Hill case. But essentially, so this God Squad, they could, say maybe there was a hypothetical, or maybe they did look at the TVA versus Hill case and they're like, yeah, we did, we spent $80 million on this dam already. It's already well underway. It'll do some benefits to the community as well. Maybe they'll get some good, power out of it, hydropower. I don't know. I am spitballing with that, but maybe they'll get some, they're going to weigh those benefits of the action versus okay, well, we do enjoy the dam, all that's lost for the snail darter. But and then maybe there's a lack of reasonable and prudent alternatives, so they just have to go forth with it. It's essential. And I think like the regional or national significance, I think that is like in respect to like military, like maybe there's a military like national security or something, but. And I think in the book it said the God Squad's only been assembled like a very few times. I don't know. Yeah, it doesn't sound like they've done a whole lot. You have had a huge impact at least. But the critical habitat, So anyway, you can definitely see how in the the change from the 1973 ESA to the 1978 ESA amendments post TVA v. Hill, how it dulled the Section 7 teeth a little bit, by changing on what grounds they would designate best available or critical habitat. What is the citizen petition provision as found in the ESA? So essentially, any species, listing for a species can be petitioned by citizens of the United States. So it doesn't have to be an agency that brings potential cause for concern of a species up. Citizens can petition for it, and then following the petition, the Fish and Wildlife Service has or NOAA has 90 days post petition, whether it's warranted, unwarranted, or warranted but precluded by other agency priorities. So essentially, that 90-day window is just like evaluating, like, we're not going to go forward with this potential for listing, or we are, or maybe it is warranted that we go forward with this, but we're busy as is, I guess, or we have other things to take care of at this time. Man, I might have to go to the restroom again. This is about where I called it yesterday. I think I might do the same because I'm getting into questions that I was on yesterday. Let's see what else I got on here. So I think with the next one I'll probably start at the beginning and work back. So I'm gonna hang it up here. I'm at an hour 20. So that'll do it. I got probably at least gonna try to do a few more of these before the exam. I guess I got this week and then next week. So it's like a week and 4 days, I guess, essentially. So about a little under 2 weeks. But so I'm just gonna keep going. Thanks. Bye.